Welcome also from my side to this webinar, Taxes or Limits. My name is Magdalena Heuwieser, or Lena. I'm also co-founder and campaigner of Stay Grounded, and I'll lead you through our webinar today. So this webinar is intended as a space of strategic discussion, mostly for campaigners and groups working on aviation, but others. And there are quite some people registered to the webinar from different organizations, from the Tax Justice Network, several organizations working on aviation in UK, France, Switzerland, Spain, Germany, and also international networks like the Global Forest Coalition. So I hope that we can share our opinions on this topic and discuss the following questions. Should our campaigns rather focus on taxes, on reducing demand through higher prices for aviation by taxing kerosene, tickets, or frequent flyers? Or should we rather push for limits to short-haul flights or flights in general, airport capacity, or even personal flight contingents, or both, even though we know that campaigns need to be also focused. So today we want to discuss pros and cons of taxes and limits, taking into account the implications from a justice perspective, the effects on the climate and the feasibility of the measure, and also ask ourselves which demands are currently in the COVID-19 situation the most viable and important ones. So I'll present you the agenda. We'll have the following speakers in the beginning, and they hopefully already get into a fierce debate among them to set the ground for a debate with all of you afterwards. So after I shortly present some key questions and theses on taxes versus limits, we will have an input by Kretzschmar, also from Stay Grounded, on it will be rather a broad vision for reduced aviation, and like some thoughts about like what could be a long-term goal, and what do taxes or limits then mean in this context. So we'll start with like a more broader vision that can then be discussed. Then we will have Bill Hemmings, an aviation consultant who worked for a very long time for Transport and Environment, to probably hold a fierce input on why we need a kerosene tax and why it is important to focus on this right now. And then we will have Alethea Warrington from the UK charity organization Possible, talking about a frequent flyer levy, so a tax focusing on like a tax that raises the prices with every flight taken, and especially here about the feasibility and concrete implementation possibilities of such a levy. Then we will have Dardenne from Transport and Environment on Transport and Environment's analysis of pros and cons of taxes and of limits. And then Tony Smith, an ecological economist, who's also who worked a lot on the editor, sorry, I was missing the word, who's the editor of the Degrowth of Aviation report, which Stay Grounded published last November, following a conference we had on the question of degrowth of aviation and which measures do we need in order to degrow, to reduce aviation. So this is basically, so the topic we discussed today has already been discussed before in this conference, but discussions have been going forward, and the times have changed since last year. So it makes total sense to really have a focused discussion today also on the question taxes or limits. And after these inputs, we might also have some short comments by Gabriela Vegatelles from the indigenous coordination from Eastern Mexico State in the defense of land, water, and culture. She might share her view on the topic, since only Europeans have been speaking then, and I think it might be interesting I think the European perspectives don't represent all civil society voices, so it might be interesting to hear a perspective from you, Gabriela, and also from Naomi Fowler from the Tax Justice Network, who's also here today. So looking forward to their contributions and then to the contributions of all of you. So I will now present the questions I have to all of the speakers and to you, which I want to discuss with you today, and some short thesis on those questions. So the first one would be, what are the implications of taxes or limits from a justice perspective? So you've probably heard this debate also a lot of times, that on the one hand, price instruments like taxes on kerosene on tickets can lead to actually fewer people being able to afford flying, while the wealthy could maybe continue with their jet-setting habits. So it could be in this opinion, like with this perspective, it could be not a very just measure, but at the same time, there's a big tax injustice when comparing different modes of transport, with aviation receiving high and direct subsidies through tax exemptions, and flights being currently the mode of transport by a wealthy minority. So this is maybe one of the main questions we would like to discuss here, like, are taxes just, or how can they be just? There's also the question of global justice, like effects on the global south of such measures and scales where it could be implemented. Definitely the global north is most responsible for flights historically and today, so this is also something to take into account when discussing this. And of course, there's the question of a just transition and how to deal with all the jobs lost when introducing these measures. Really working for a just transition and taking the concerns by workers seriously is the only way to build support and realistically implement such measures. But we will not talk explicitly on a just transition here today, because this is something Stay Grounded is working on in other webinars and working groups, and I just wanted to mention this as one dimension of the justice perspective. So the next question is, what are the effects of these measures on the climate? Which would be the most effective for reducing the climate impact of aviation? So a kerosene tax could reduce the privileges of aviation, could raise prices, but it depends, of course, also how high are the prices in order to have a real effect on demand. Then banning short-haul flights would be like one of the limits that could be discussed. It doesn't have a high climate impact probably, because long-haul flights consume most emissions, but it might help shifting mindsets and therefore reduce aviation on the longer run. And this might be similar with shutting down regional airports or shutting down airports and limiting airport capacity. Then the next question is, what is the feasibility of the different measures? A kerosene tax has been demanded for decades, but the aviation lobby has so far succeeded in spreading the lie that this is illegal, while we know that it is not. In the EU, a kerosene tax might be difficult to achieve on a EU level, but bilateral agreements could be enforced. I'm sure Bill will talk more about this. Ticket taxes are in place in many countries, but way too low. So could they be raised? This would definitely be a very feasible measure if it makes sense to focus on that. Then we will also discuss the feasibility of a frequent flyer levy. Maybe a very just instrument, but until now not implemented anywhere, and for many hard to imagine how it could be implemented. And then for limits on airports or in flights, the question is like which laws would actually allow this? Would it be through laws on noise and health regulations, or would there be any other laws that could make such limits of flights and airports feasible? And the fourth question is, what is currently in the COVID-19 situation the most effective demand? So some say that if taxpayers' money saved the aviation industry, then the industry has now to start paying taxes. So the demand for taxes could work perfectly in this current moment. While others argue that taxes on the industry would hurt the industry too much in times of crisis, which is why such measures are even harder to achieve now than before. And then there's also on the limit side, limits on airports is something that is actually being like achieved by COVID-19 indirectly, because the expansion of airport infrastructure is likely to be delayed for years. And so the question is, does it make sense currently to actually fight for limits to airports? Is that a reason for doing it in the current times, or is the problem already solved by itself? And the question is also, has the experience of being grounded during COVID-19, has this possibly changed the public perception of the importance of flights, or could limits on flights actually be easier to achieve right now than before? So I'm now done with speaking and want to hand over to the first speaker, who is Kretzschmar. No, sorry, I forgot something. Before we start with all the inputs, I would like to make a very short poll in order to, and make the same poll at the end, in order to just quickly see what is your current perception. What do you think currently makes sense, rather going towards taxes or rather going towards limits? So I'll just launch this poll. Do you see it? Do you see the poll? Yes? Yes. Okay, great. So please answer the question. I don't know if I haven't made this. I just once made it, and I hope this works technically. So I hope you all voted, and I will end the polling. For me, it doesn't work. Does it work for you? Yes? Okay, then I don't see the results. You see them. That's interesting.
It's 59% taxes and 55% limits.
Okay.
So it adds up to more than 100.
That's true. Yeah, I didn't. Well, it's
probably
it's
you could choose both.
Some vote for both. Okay. Mira, can you note down those numbers so that we can do in the end do the same poll again?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. So now, Anne, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much, Lena. So my task is in this short input to go a bit beyond our usual boxes of what is directly politically feasible, and remind us that we're struggling not only for reduction of aviation, but for climate justice, which includes a change of our economic system, but also new ways probably of basic democracy decision-making that puts the direct needs of people and our environment in the center. And I think the first difficulty when we talk about system change, which would mean this change also of our economic system and the way many of us live at the moment, is that we still can't really envision it, and that we are kind of trapped in our way of thinking that we grew up with. And this makes it quite difficult to think about a system and measures that don't need, for example, price mechanisms, or that may function without prices at all. So also for me, it's quite difficult to do so without feeling ashamed or feeling very naive. But I'm convinced we need to strengthen our imaginary sense here. So I'll try a bit towards the end of this input. And the second difficulty, I think, is that given the fact we still live in an economy where prices and price mechanisms play a major role as distribution factor, we can't totally ignore them, even if we were convinced the world would be better off without them. So looking at this second difficulty, the first thing that comes in my mind when talking about limits or taxes and whether they're feasible, I think that, and whether we need to, whether they're feasible, I think that we already have a lot of mechanisms to put also absolute limits on flights and of course on other fossil or destructive industry. So it's often argued that limits and caps counter freedom, but I guess many of us know or agree that freedom kind of ends there where the freedom of others or the health and human rights of others starts. And that also taxes kind of limit freedom when we look at the freedom of people who can't afford to pay the higher price then. So when looking at the planning of new airports or the limitation on night flights that we have at some airports, or the general limitation on flights due to noise, space, or security reasons, or whatsoever, I would say that we see that every new bit of an airport, every single new flight slot already now needs approval. So it's kind of limited in a way already. And that there are various reasons why this could be denied, like the new airport or new flight slots. Even, of course, I would say that the reasons are not used often enough, that we would need more limitations. But theoretically, they exist and are rooted already in our legislation. So when talking about limits and being pushed back for this, I think we must recognize that we already have a system where we have limits and ways to enforce them, and that the idea of limitation is not at all something that doesn't exist in our society or economy. The laws to limit traffic at airport exist, and we would just need to strengthen, for example, noise or environmental arguments and integrate climate conditions. So in a way, regardless of whether we talk about the current system or the time after an achieved system change, introducing stronger limits to flights should technically not be a problem. So I agree, of course, that we'll get strong resistance from many sides for it. But especially now with the pandemic already grounding many flights, I think it would be quite easy, like relatively easy, for politicians to argue why regional airports need to close, why bigger airports need to limit their capacity, and why some airlines shouldn't be bailed out, but money should be spent for training the workers into other sectors. And if we really want to stay within the limits of the 1.5 target, we'll need to massively reduce and limit aviation in the global north and agree internationally on a limit of flights that's bearable for the climate. This could, of course, also include taxes if they're high enough to really reduce flights to that limit. But the more secure way, I guess, would be to set absolute caps. But this then leads to the second main question regarding limits for me, which is, in my opinion, much more tricky. And that's the question of justice and just distribution. Here we can't really argue anymore scientifically with what amount of flights might be bearable for the climate, but must look at the needs of people and their different realities. So once we have a clear cap on flights, the question will be who takes those flights. And even without any taxes, prices would probably skyrocket once there's a clear limitation to flights, since it would need to be quite high if we want to achieve the climate goals. There are ideas of giving per capita flights, like let's say 10 flights per capita per person per life. But apart from the fact that this would still be too much to reach any climate targets, I would argue that this also isn't really just. Because why should I, for example, who hasn't got any family or close people abroad in a distance that I can reach by train, or that doesn't need to fly for my job, have the same amount of flights like a person who was forced to migrate, has family and close ones far away, lives on an island or in a country locked by mountains, or has a job where flying is really inevitable. But I would also strongly counter the idea to trade flight permissions between countries or people, since this would only once more lead to the rich buying all the flights, where the poor are forced to sell their right to fly, regardless of their need to use it. So instead, I would say that we need to think more about democratic distribution measures that involve out of a societal discussion about what are needed and what are bullshit flights. I know this seems to be quite unthinkable at the moment, but I'm convinced this need to have this discussion holds true not only for aviation, but also for energy, for food, for housing, and for resource management in general. I think that if we want to live in this world without destroying it and with a just distribution of the given resources, we need to really spark or foster the discussion about those distribution processes. If we want degrowth, we can't leave this to price mechanisms or coincidence, because I guess neither of them will include justice aspects. I'm quite convinced this would work best within small communities, and this is kind of where it comes to the vision part. So like regional councils or small communities where people know each other or are closer to each other and could distribute given resources. In this case, for example, the amount of flights per year for X number of people living in that council. They could distribute the given resources alongside the to be defined criteria of which flights are needed. And those criteria could generally be agreed on internationally, but leaving space to adapt them to local situations and needs. I know that in the following inputs, we'll hear a lot also about price instruments and about measures that are feasible and could be implemented now or very soon. And I'm, of course, not against those discussions or those ideas, but with my input, I wanted a bit to widen this picture and to show that to reach distributive justice in a given situation of limited air travel, we will need to think outside our boxes and envision a fight for a future where distribution of resources is agreed on alongside needs and justice criteria. So for the meantime, I would argue that limit and taxes is definitely no either or, but both very necessary, and that at the moment we should definitely campaign on closing airports, stopping any new airport infrastructure in the global north and also in the global south, of course, and reducing capacities at airports. And given the situation with COVID, I think there's a really good chance that they won't open again. And we should, additionally to that, train our imaginary sense and work on narratives on climate just future with clear limits on flights and the democratic decision-making process on how to distribute them in a socially just way. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this broader perspective. I think this is a very, very good start, because sometimes we tend to be very much focused on the next steps and low-hanging fruits, and to have the future goals in mind, which maybe are not the goals of all of us, but I think one perspective, and we will discuss this later. So I would just ask if there are any questions of understanding to what Anne just presented. So no, not really going into discussion yet, but did you not understand anything? Do you want Anne to repeat something or deepen a thought she had? If not, okay, then there was some discussion going on in the chat, but I think I will leave it in there.
I think there was one question on what is a bullshit flight.
Ah.
Well, that's to be defined, right? I think that's exactly the question that we, yeah, maybe I would say a bullshit flight is a flight to go one day shopping to another continent and back. That's maybe a very easy definition of a bullshit flight. But going beyond this, it's probably not that easy at some points anymore. The idea is more to start the discussion about what are really needed flights. And this is often something others can't really define for you. But that's why I said, like in smaller communities, it might be easier, because when you have a given amount of flights to share with others that you kind of know, it might be easier to accept that the flight and somebody else takes is maybe more needed than the one you would take, because you know the situation of the other person. Maybe that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we can later on also discuss more about what are bullshit flights. Next on our speakers list, I have Bill Hemmings, aviation consultant, and he will speak on the need for a kerosene tax. And feel free to also relate to the input before you.
Thanks, Lena. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Hemmings. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to speak from my experience. I worked for 10 years for one of the best airlines in the world, in Hong Kong, in Indonesia, in Bahrain, in Amsterdam, and in Germany. And then in Europe, I set up a travel procurement company for suppliers. Our biggest client was Airbus, and then I ran American Express business travel consulting for a couple of years before spending 10 years on aviation and shipping with transport and environment. I'm now working independently. So I agree entirely with the previous speaker, Anna, that we need both taxes and limits. So I don't think we can disagree on that at all. Maybe taxes first, though, remembering that Benjamin Franklin said, in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes. Well, we're all worried about death now with COVID. We should actually start worrying about taxes as well. And we all live in the EU, or most of us do, remembering that EU is actually a low tax environment for aviation, except Boris's paradise in the United Kingdom is probably the country with the highest aviation taxes in the world. And believe it or not, Trump's paradise in the United States also taxes aviation at much higher levels than Europe does, partly because they do, but also partly Europe chose airport charges rather than taxation. And so the taxation regime in the US is much stronger. So I want to just demonstrate quickly that taxes on aviation are legal. They're certainly feasible. They will certainly have an impact on climate by reducing demand, which we're all looking for, as well as they will generate revenues which can be used to fight climate change. There's certainly tax justice in there. It certainly is tax unjust not to tax aviation, given that other forms of transport, particularly road transport, are taxed. And maybe to the contrary of what Lena suggested, if you ask me, given all that I've thought about this issue over the many years, if ever there was a time to do action, it is now. In that respect, COVID is a great gift to actually do something finally about aviation. Mary, if you can move to the next slide, please. So I want to quote here from some very relevant stuff that was presented by Brian Pearce, who's the chief economist of IATA, last week, and the details of his webinar you'll see on the last page of the presentation. That's pretty awful if you're an airline, and indeed if you are used to flying. There is no such thing as international aviation at the moment, and if you argue that flights within Europe are actually in Europe's domestic backyard, they've increased a bit, but since July, in fact, they've fallen back in August now and September because the virus was resurging. Next slide, please. Now, this is interesting. Remember that you know, the bailout money is running out, and the Congress in the States is preparing maybe to renew it. And so you've got to look at a chart like this, which was prepared by IATA, and wonder to what extent this is all fear-mongering to plead for more bailouts. But if you listen to Brian Pearce, I think the tone has changed in the industry, and they realize that bailouts ain't going to last forever, and they might not last much longer, and that the catastrophic fall in traffic, because they're not allowed to fly, points now to bankruptcies, and that will be the focus of the future. Next slide, please. So this, according to IATA, they've received about 180 billion so far in bailouts. 180 billion is 25% of annual aviation revenues in 2019. It's 6 times the industry's profit last year. You'll see that the exoneration of taxes on the right-hand side, there's only about, what, 5%, 9.5 billion. Corporate tax rebate is less than that, is more than that rather, at 12. And quite a lot has gone into wage subsidies to keep people employed. And a hell of a lot has gone into airline operations, and we know some of the things they have or haven't done with that. The bottom slide shows the IATA projection of the average cash that's left to airlines that are still in existence. 30 or 40 have gone into bankruptcy so far, and the average airline's got about 6 months of cash left. So in that background, let's move on to the next slide. So I would argue that the degrowth that Stay Grounded and others are talking about is with us with a vengeance. There is virtually no international aviation, and none of us know when it's going to recover. And in fact, we know that things are getting worse, not only in Europe, but in India and the United States in terms of the virus. But from an aviation perspective, most airlines make their money in summer, not in winter. No one much travels in winter. And so we're now facing the aviation winter season, which goes from October to April. It is going to be financially very brutish. And if there is to be a recovery after that, it's going to be painful and slow, because a lot of people will have lost their jobs. Aircraft will have been retired and sent to the wreckers, and there'll be capacity in the system that has been lost and very difficult to recover. The only market, and this is what IATA says, and then the Chinese aviation specialists were talking last week, domestic aviation in China is pretty well back to what it was pre-COVID. But the message, you know, even though they do want bailouts, the message is coming pretty loud and strong, that now is the time that the industry is going to have to restructure and downsize dramatically. the revenue is way behind even the capacity. So you might read that airlines are advertising, right? But in fact, their load factors are pretty dreadful. All this means from an airline perspective that fares will go one way only, and that is up. Costs are going up, people are still there, and aircraft are not full. And so if either fares go up or pretty quickly you don't operate at all. Airports themselves are on a life support system. They're getting no money, so forget about expansion. And you've seen where the expansion has been cancelled. And the air traffic system, it's run basically by government-owned entities in each country. They're not getting any revenues, and they have all these civil servants who are employed sitting around doing very little. And so the air traffic system in Europe, even if it's not very efficient, is now in an appalling financial situation. Next slide, thanks, Mira. In terms of the bailouts, Lufthansa, this is OAG's webinar also earlier this month. Amazingly, Lufthansa and Air France have been given $372 and $334 per seat mounted, which is extraordinary. Beaten only by Singapore Airlines and Cathay Pacific in Asia, and that Alethea figure is provisional. My argument is this, that everything is now up for grabs in the aviation industry. It's going to get far worse than before it even starts to get better. No one knows what they can fly and when and how often, and there've been a hell of a lot of cancellations from flights which have been mounted over the past 3 months. Now is the time that governments have to tell airlines, as you start to recover, you're going to have to start recovering external costs through taxation. We can talk about how it is. So the analogy is that you put the frog in cold water and you slowly turn up the heat, and eventually you get what you want, which is a cooked frog. Industry and the Commission will say this forever. Oh no, we can't do anything until the industry's recovered. That is, we just talked about bullshit flights. Well, that is absolute bullshit. If you wait until the industry's recovered, then you will never achieve anything, like we've never ever achieved anything so far, because the competitive pressures alone on airlines once things are back to normal is too great, and it's very, very difficult then to increase fares, because all you do is you lose market share. And so the temperature has to be frog has to be put in the water now, and the temperature has to be started up slowly. Aviation is going to be smaller and more beautiful, or less beautiful in the future. As I said, degrowth is already with us in spades. And that means only one thing for any economist and for anyone who's in charge of airline pricing, that fares will be higher. And so there's room to put environmental taxation in there. Next slide, thanks. CORSIA. Let's be polite and say it will have no effect for years now. International aviation is a complete standstill.
Can you just explain CORSIA for those who don't know about it, just what it means?
CORSIA is the international obligation to buy offsets using airline revenues to reduce emissions in other countries. And it was to be for all growth above 2020 levels. And now that the baseline has been changed and there is no growth, it will take 4 or 5, maybe more years to actually get to the baseline growth, which is now the year 2019, before you'll have to have any offsetting requirement. The other important thing is that in the past, 60% of aviation emissions were international and 40% were domestic. It's now more like 90% are domestic and 10%. So ICAO, as an international regulator, is being pushed right to the back seat. Who is regulating now? It is very clearly that it is countries. Now, the European Commission is looking at revising and how to implement CORSIA, even though it's on its last legs. They're only committed to it because they think if they pull the rug out from under it, then everyone will blame Europe, and they've been fed up with being blamed about trying to take initiatives in the past, and therefore they don't want to be the ones seeing to kill it. And so they're proposing how to implement CORSIA in Europe. They've come up with a clean cut option, which means that whatever we do, CORSIA won't apply within Europe. That will be the ETS only. And I would argue that we don't need CORSIA on long-haul flights either, because there won't be any requirement to do anything for 5 or 6 years. As Lena said, we have ticket taxes. We don't have enough of them, and they're not high enough. And they can be implemented by any country. You don't have to ask permission of anybody. You don't have to ask permission of the European Commission, the European Council, Trump, or indeed ICAO. Mrs. van der Leyen touts the idea that she wants to get rid of free allowances. Well, free allowances were only created in the original ETS because there was some fear that there could be leakage over the Gulf or over Turkey. Once you had stopped the clock in 2012, there was absolutely no possibility of carbon leakage within Europe, and therefore no justification for free allowances. And so they should have been abolished in 2012. They weren't. Abolishing them now is the right thing to do. It's long overdue, but it's hardly reform. The carbon floor price in the ETS we know is way too low, and it can be increased by having a fuel tax, which would be an aviation floor price within the ETS. There are other sectors of the ETS which have carbon taxes. They're at a national level, and there's no reason why you can't have a floor price on aviation in the ETS. I know that some of you don't like ETS, then we can go for a fuel tax and ticket taxes instead. You need to be aware that once the UK officially leaves at the end of this year in terms of regulation, the ETS coverage for aviation reduces by almost a third. And so ambition for Paris and 2030 targets drops 31%. Half of that is the UK inventory and half of that is European inventory. What are you going to do? What is anyone going to do about it? Well, Europe is hoping that Boris will have his own ETS. No, still go back, mirror. Europe is hoping that Boris will have an aviation ETS and they'll be linked. If you think there's going to be a nice agreement between Boris and Europe, then it's not looking very hopeful at the moment. So how do you cater for the situation where you don't have an agreement? The UK has already told airlines operating in the UK that they need to prepare for either an ETS on all flights from the UK to Europe from next January, or that there'll be a carbon tax on such flights. The Europeans have said nothing officially to European airlines about this, and that's rather appalling. And the other thing, now that hopefully the ambition level is going to be raised to 55% in 2030, you could tighten the provisions for allowances allocation in the aviation ETS. Next slide, please, Mira. Nearly finished. So, start taxing aviation now. Fuel taxation was decided actually 20 years ago. Spain and Ireland actually nixed an automatic fuel tax. If they hadn't nixed that at the 2000 Ecofin just before the Energy Tax Directive had been agreed, we would now have a 33% minimum fuel tax on all aviation across the EU. So go and thank the Spaniards and go and thank Ireland in particular, which has one of the highest per capita incomes in Europe. The Commission, what's that, 23 years ago, said tax fuel bilaterally. For some reason, the Commission, the Commissioner, they want to go back and look at their navels for another 2 or 3 years and redo all the work that was done 23 years ago. Whereas the Finance Minister said a year ago, it's appalling that road fuel is taxed at maybe 65 cents a litre and aviation is not, so let's get on with it. So a lot of what's going on in the Commission, I think, is just foot dragging. Now, at Brexit, even if there's no deal between Boris and Europe, there has to be a deal on aviation for all sorts of legal and liability reasons. There has to be a deal. It might be one cooked up at the last minute, but there has to be a deal. And the European Council has said very clearly in a decision, that we're not going to give Boris a tax exemption on fuel. This is the first time it's ever happened in European history, and I think it's the first time it's happened in aviation history since 1945, that a country, in this case 27 of them, has said, we are not going to give a fuel tax exemption. It's extraordinary, and it needs to be supported here in Brussels, across Europe, with the German presidency, and in Whitehall. And as I said, Boris is actually considering the carbon tax on aviation. There's a consultation that's out there, and you'll see at the bottom that you've got another week or so to reply and say to Boris, yet do it, Boris. He's already famous for all sorts of things. Why not be famous for having a carbon tax on aviation? Next slide. So you'll see in the studies that are listed in the next slide that 43 odd countries tax domestic aviation fuel, but for reasons best known to the Europeans, they have this energy tax directive around their neck, which prevents them, but they can still do it bilaterally. All those countries, even the Saudis tax fuel, the Egyptians tax fuel, the Ethiopians tax fuel. Europe doesn't. Many, I don't know the list. You'd have to pay some money to IATA. They can list you. It's probably 40, 50 or 60 countries have aviation ticket taxes around the world. And almost every country taxes road fuel. There's a list of them on the left, on the graph on the left. India has had a domestic fuel tax for years. It's very high. Everyone complains about it, but if India can do it, then why can't other countries? And as this press statement said on May the 7th, 2020, the fuel tax on road vehicles in India is now about the highest in the world. So I don't see any reason from a tax justice perspective that if it's good enough to tax road fuel in countries like India, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and wherever else, why anyone should be given a tax exemption on a flight. We're going to talk about frequent flyer levies. I would argue that let's tax every flight through fuel taxation and ticket taxes first, and then we can talk about levies later, and there are legal and feasibility issues. The last slide is some homework and reading for you. So there we are. Two things are inevitable. We're going to die, and we're going to pay aviation taxes. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bill. It was quite detailed and very concrete already. Thank you. So there is legislative ground for pushing for kerosene tax now in the country, especially in the EU. So there have been some questions concerning the technical language, especially around the European emissions trading scheme, but I would actually try not to focus too much now on the technicalities of ETS, because that's not the main topic of today, and we will then don't have enough time for the discussion. So I just want to ask, is there any very urgent question right now? Then please speak up. Like somebody
I just see, I mean, the link to the aviation, the UK consultation on a carbon tax for aviation is on the last page of the slide. So you can, if you look at the slide, you'll get the link there.
Mira just copied all the links in your last slide into the chat, so you can see them. And okay, I guess if there are no questions of understanding, then we would continue with the next presentation, which is by Alethea Warrington from Possible. And you will talk about the frequent flyer levy, which was just mentioned. So Ali, please go ahead.
Hi everybody, I'm Ali and I'm a campaigner at Possible, which is a climate action charity in the UK. I'm going to talk about where we're up to on tackling aviation emissions using taxes or limits, and why we think that a progressive tax is needed as one of the measures to tackle aviation emissions. So we think that a progressive measure such as the frequent flyer levy is needed in order to get levels of flying to decrease in a way that's fair and gets public support, but we definitely don't think that it's the only measure that we need. And we're in favour of using a combination of various taxes and limits to tackle emissions. And I'll also talk briefly about how the frequent flyer levy would actually be implemented. So it's clear that in coming decades, aviation demand is going to have to be constrained to fit within carbon budgets. It can't go back to the post-COVID levels of demand or the rate at which that demand was increasing. So really the key question is distribution. And those questions need to bear in mind that aviation is a luxury good. It's mainly used for leisure activities, so these aren't survival emissions. So everyone on this call has probably heard the distribution stats in the UK, that just 15% of people take 70% of the flights, around half of the population don't fly at all in any given year, and just 1% of people are responsible for nearly 1 in 5 international flights. And this distribution is echoed in other countries. Globally, between countries, the situation is even more unequal. So there's a very unfair distribution of who actually gets the benefits from an activity which has a really high emissions impact. And as other sectors decarbonise, aviation is going to make up a bigger and bigger chunk of remaining carbon budgets. The UK projections suggest that aviation emissions will be around 1/3 of the UK's total emissions by 2050, which is a huge proportion for something that a very substantial chunk of the population aren't benefiting from in any given year. So the ideal policy to tackle this would both reduce overall demand and also redistribute remaining flights more equally across the income spectrum. If demand or capacity are constrained without measures to redistribute demand and reallocate it more fairly, then that's going to worsen the existing patterns of inequality. So there are various policies or tax levers that could reduce overall emissions to a set limit if they were cranked up high enough. But the question is, how do we ensure that that's done in a way that provides a more equitable and progressive distribution of the remaining carbon budget for flying? So we think that policies on decarbonisation in general need to be fair and seen to be fair in order to be accepted. If they're seen as, you know, providing a get-out clause for the wealthiest to keep on polluting while everyone else has to make huge changes, that's not going to be something that gets public acceptance. You know, the changes to a essentially decarbonised world need to be seen to work for everyone if they're going to be accepted. So the frequent flyer levy is a tool to ensure fairness as well as reducing emissions, and it's a way of reallocating remaining flights within the context of the need to constrain demand. We did some polling back in 2018 that found the frequent flyer levy was the most popular policy option, and that's because people recognise and value fairness. So the frequent flyer levy is a progressive tax, and it increases per flight that somebody takes in a given time period. So it would make air travel slightly more accessible for the very poorest, while progressively penalising those who fly the most. Ideally, the way in which this would be implemented would be a form of air miles levy. So one that closely links the degree of taxation to the distance that somebody's flying, and would also like the class of flight to be taken into account, because this would help the tax to correlate as closely as possible with the emissions caused by that individual's travel choices. We haven't yet been able to model how an air miles levy would work in practice, just because of the complexities of modelling that, which is why our research so far has been talking about a frequent flyer levy. But we really don't think it's a question of either or in terms of which policies we use to reduce flying, and there's clearly a need for a combination of measures to tackle it. So we think a frequent flyer levy would replace air passenger duty, which is a tax per ticket levied at a very flat rate in the UK at the moment. but would also like to see flights brought into VAT, which is the UK's value added tax on most consumer products. And would also like to see a tax put on jet fuel to make the treatment of air travel fairer compared to other forms of transport. So just to give you an example, at the moment in the UK, air tickets are 0 rated for VAT, but you'll pay VAT at a rate of 20% on a bike. I mean, that's clearly not encouraging low carbon travel choices. But we are also in favour of limit measures. We'd like to see short haul flights replaced with a reliable and affordable train network. We think there's absolutely no case for airport expansion as well. But while a tax on kerosene by itself might be able to reduce emissions by the required amount if it was levied at a high enough rate, those reductions wouldn't be fair or progressive. We've got some new research modelling this, which I wanted to be able to talk to you about today, but unfortunately we haven't been able to get it out yet because we need to do some more updating, so it's done on the pre-COVID numbers, but I'll share that as soon as it is available. But I just wanted to briefly mention a paper that came out earlier this summer, which looks at kind of the same question through a slightly different angle in terms of whose welfare is impacted by different ways of distributing flights, which finds that under a frequent flyer levy, it's the wealthiest who take most of the hit to the reduction in their welfare rather than the poorest. So that's why I would like to see other fiscal measures such as a tax on fuel and the end of 0 VAT rating. We think that needs to be brought in combination with a tax such as the frequent flyer levy, which provides a progressive disincentive to the frequent flyers who are causing, the bulk of the problem of aviation emissions. We think that's really important for public consent as well. So just briefly on implementation, in order to bring in a national UK-based frequent flyer levy based on the number of flights, which, as I mentioned, is not the most sophisticated or the best way of doing that. That would be a flight levied in terms of air miles. But the changes that would need is, one is that the UK tax authorities would need access to data that's already captured by the Home Office in the UK on passenger movements into and out of the country. And this would have to be stored in an automated database, which airlines could access in real time while selling tickets to customers. And airlines would also need to record customers' passport numbers at the point of ticket sale, rather than after ticket sale and before boarding. So we think that both of those would be implementable. We think that would be feasible changes. Obviously, though, it makes much more sense to implement a frequent flyer levy globally or regionally rather than just nationally. Otherwise, you could have issues around displacement. So we've started looking at patterns of frequent flying in other countries as a kind of first stage of looking into how this would work. In terms of what makes most sense at the moment as a demand, given the impacts of COVID on the sector, we're thinking at the moment about green jobs, particularly for aviation workers who are being treated so badly by airlines. And we're thinking about ways in which the tax take from a frequent flyer levy could be used to support aviation workers whose jobs are at risk or are being cut by airlines. And again, this is something that's really important for justice considerations. We haven't figured out yet how implementable that would be, partly due to the fact that hypothecation isn't actually a thing that the government does, and also due to the reduced tax take from aviation due to the impact of COVID. But we think that that's a really important principle, and we want to find a way to make that argument about using the tax take from a progressive tax on aviation to support green jobs. There's also the big question of how we talk about demand reduction in the context of COVID. We've been thinking about how we can frame that in terms of not going back to business as usual and building a transport system that works better for everyone. So yeah, in summary, what we'd really like is a taxation system for aviation that includes an element of a progressively rising levy, which is based on the amount of flying that an individual does within a fixed time period. And we think that's an essential ingredient to be in the mix to ensure that aviation taxes are fair and get public acceptance. Well, I'll pop a link to that paper I mentioned in the chat as well, because people might be interested to see it.
That's great. Thank you. The paper you mentioned, which was released early summer, on whose welfare is impacted by distributed flights.
That's the one, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Ali, for your interesting input. So I got the idea that you found out that in the UK, it would be feasible to implement a frequent flyer levy based on the number of flights people have taken, not yet on the miles flown by people.
That's right,
and
yeah, which is, yeah, that's not
at
just,
that level, it's also still quite complicated and not researched yet how it could be implemented, right?
Yeah, so it's not so much that the implementation would be more complicated, although it possibly would be. It's that getting the data on flights and then analysing it is more complicated. I don't think we think it would be like unfeasibly complicated to actually implement that. It's just the modelling that we haven't done.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions of understanding to the input on the frequent flyer levy? I just have, I don't know if you mentioned it. What about data security? Do you think this could be an issue?
Sorry, was that status insecurity?
Like data insecurity, like the personal data being shared by too many stakeholders, being maybe dangerous.
I mean, in theory, you know, the body which collects the data is a government department. The body which would need access to it is also a government department. I know the UK state is not functioning all that well at the moment, but in theory, government departments should be able to share basic data on who's entering and leaving the country without causing problems.
All right, thank you. I think there were no further questions. So thank you. I will now go on to the next presentation by Tony Smith, ecological economist, and ask you to please stick to the 7 minutes, because we haven't really been able to do that in the last inputs, and we want to leave some space for discussion later. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Lena. I think I will stay to the 7 minutes. I don't have slides in so much detail prepared as the other speakers. And I mainly wanted to try and lift some of the perspectives at the end, drawing both from this report, Degrowth of Aviation, which I edited, which came out of the conference in Barcelona last year, and also some of my work in the degrowth movement and in a Norwegian campaign for systems change. So I think quite a few things actually are interesting across these different campaigns or activities. And it seems like those of us who have already talked agree very much on that we need to combine limits and fiscal measures, which was also what we concluded in the Degrowth of Aviation report last year. But although then we also didn't really try to draw too many conclusions across measures, just saying let's really explore each of them. But still, I think there is really the situation, agreeing with Anne, that while we need to change our mindset, we also need to relate to the world as it is today. Still, what I want to highlight is one of the things that was very clear from data that we collected for the report, and I think Bill also showed some really interesting data that supports this, that the aviation sector is receiving a massive indirect, massive indirect subsidies. And this is really something that we cannot, there is no reason to accept, and that we should use for what it's worth. However, we address the kind of measures or fiscal measures or other measures that we would like to then work further on. So there are two things that I would like to address just here at the end. One is that to discuss what is effective when we discuss measures, and also to address the issue of justice a little bit. So I think very often, I now speak a little bit as an ecological economist as well, very often when we discuss fiscal measures, from economists, what comes up is the issue of bureaucracy and costs, and that we need to be efficient. And this is really an issue to really have in mind, that we always, from our perspective, need to discuss effect. What is effective, not what is efficient, which is very much a focus of this more broad discussions about an economy-wide carbon tax as well. And I also had an interesting debate in Norway from the perspective of the systems change campaign, where I got involved in a newspaper debate with somebody from a left-wing party who was very focused on distributional issues, and who is in Norway promoting what is usually called carbon tax for redistribution, which we haven't discussed so much in our report last year, and also it wasn't discussed much here today, which is not specifically for the aviation industry, but it's a way to think about how to tax the carbon transition in a more just way. So, but it's also a very bureaucratic system, one can say, but basically carbon or fossil fuels are taxed and then redistributed equally to everyone. And one assumes that those who are richest will use the most fossil fuel, pay the most tax, and that it's therefore a kind of progressive taxation. Now, from an ecological economics perspective, the question is what the effect is of such a system, because we are not going to reduce the amount of money and money flow and the size of the economy, which is also an issue if we really look at the big perspective here. So I just wanted to mention that those kinds of thoughts as well, which we discussed a bit in our report, which we haven't touched so much today, but there are ways to think about taxing the aviation industry, not specifically aviation industry, but thinking more economy-wide, so that the aviation industry should be treated like anyone else or other sectors. Just want to mention one thing that Larry wrote in the chat is also that one could combine limits with price control to prevent profiteering. And I think this is really excellent to bring back the discussion about price control. One doesn't need to have, just because we are discussing prices and market measures, we can also remember that there are ways to limit prices in other ways. Okay, so I want to move on to the justice issue, which I think maybe I could add a little bit to the discussion or problematize it. And this is an interesting debate, I think, from the perspective of degrowth and also the Norwegian systems change campaign, that I see how often we kind of get captured in debates about that there is always some poor group who lose out, and therefore many things become very difficult to suggest. In here is where I think it's really interesting to discuss how we can shift the logic, shift the mindset, and think from a degrowth perspective, which is not just reducing aviation, but it's a vision for a different way of living with less or in more sufficiency. And here I think that is really important that while discussing measures to negatively or to reduce aviation and flights, we also need to talk about the good life and visions for how to live and how to travel in a world with less planes. Because if we discuss what is sufficiency and what is social minima that we fulfill, we don't need to be so focused all the time on the justice issue in the sense of, okay, the rich will be able to fly more than the poor, because as long as we have the economy, we have the rich will always be able to do more of something. But let's then focus on what are the minima that need to be fulfilled, and not the details of this injustice. This is what I think would be, an important feature of the discussion. So we have this issue on the national level with national justice, at least there, I think it's important. But international justice is then a little bit more tricky. I think we could also, to problematize a little bit more, discuss forced migration versus voluntary migration. So myself, for example, I live in Austria, but come from Norway. And yeah, I assume we don't talk about people who voluntarily migrate, but there are lots of people who are voluntarily migrating. So this is another issue to make this migration issue more complicated. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, there were some new points added to the discussion. Great. I would have some more questions to you, but I will wait for the discussion afterwards, especially on this topic of combining limits with price control. I can't imagine it quite well right now, but I'm sure you or Larry can afterwards say a bit more on that. Are there any other questions of understanding to Tone? No? Okay, then I would move on to Jo Dardenne from Transport and Environment for her input on the question, taxes or limits.
Thanks. So I haven't prepared any slides. I'm gonna try and make my words the best way to communicate. So the goal of my contribution is basically to put a bit of a perspective, so the pros and cons of having taxes or limits. And I'll try and share my view from Transport and Environment's position, which is a lobby group at the EU level, and so giving you a bit more of an appreciation of also the legal feasibility, because we talked a lot about social feasibility, environmental impact, but also the legal aspects of it. And so maybe I'll start by saying that, as a lot of you know already, and you've shared, that COVID has been a bit of a drama for the aviation program and the campaigns that have been going on about flying less. So I think it's true that it has, it is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. And it's mostly a challenge in terms of the narrative, because how are we supposed to, regulate a sector that is basically going bankrupt and that is, not there anymore, or when people aren't flying? The counter argument to that is that it is an opportunity because we have a chance here to highlight the unfairness of treatment. The aviation sector was the first sector to go and knock on government's doors to get treatments and billions of money and bailout. And this is now the time for governments to also be able to ask commitments from the industry to actually legislate for the price of their pollution to be better integrated in the price of the tickets, and to sort of reverse the trend that we had before, which was, well, it's cheap to fly, we can have €5 flights to wherever in Europe, and sort of reverse that tendency. And finally, overall, make 2019, the peak year for aviation emissions, and say, we can't come back to pre-COVID pollution levels because we've seen this degrowth, this unmanaged degrowth of aviation because of COVID. But now we can maybe use this as an opportunity to say, well, taxation is a way to potentially manage the degrowth moving forward. So I think something also to mention, and maybe a parallel from the aviation sector to the banking sector. You know, in the crisis in 2008, you had the banking sector, you know, was bailed out a lot. There was a lot of support made for banks, but then it was followed by a number of levies on the banking sector, you know, in various places in Europe. And the main goal of those levies were to, one, recoup the cost of the sector bailouts, to compensate, you know, taxpayers for the implicit subsidy that the sector enjoyed until then, and basically overall encourage a more, you know, more stable funding source. So, and all of these things can be replicated to today's environment for airlines, because it's a bit similar. You know, we have these billions of money that we're pouring into the sector, and we can use this argument to say, well, we're going to have to impose levies afterwards because this is the way to recoup the cost, indirect cost that the airline industry has not been paying, and also the cost that it has on taxpayers today. So I think that's something maybe that's, in terms of a campaigning angle, can also be interesting to keep in mind. So first of all, then on taxes more generally, I think what I want to share here are two perspectives: the environmental and the social perspective, and then the legal one. In terms of the environmental perspective, you know, why are we taxing aviation, and specifically on kerosene and fuel taxes? We're taxing, you know, the fuel because carbon pricing and integrating, you know, the emissions and the pollution that aviation is generating is an instrument to shift behaviors towards clean alternatives. It's a way to make people understand that it's no longer cheap to pollute. But it's not just that, it's also to create revenue, you know. So there's a price signal to shift investments, shift investments into clean technology, like, you know, new fuels, or shift investment towards alternatives, the clean transportation like rail and others. But it's also a revenue to be generated to finance a just transition within the aviation sector as well. So it's kind of twofold. We can use this as an environmental and a social argument. From a legal perspective, taxation is a bit more complicated, of course, at the European level, because the decision-making process is quite, you know, could easily be blocked, because if you want to impose a new tax at a European level, you need unanimity of member states. So all member states, all governments in Europe have to agree. And if one disagrees, then it blocks the whole process. So that's why, you know, we see a lot of national ticket taxes, you know, because it's a bit of the easier solution, it's a bit more flexibility for governments to impose. But fundamentally, you know, a kerosene tax better integrates the actual carbon component of aviation pollution, and much more than a ticket tax, for example, because a a fuel tax is linked to the amount of fuel that you burn, and so the amount of CO2 that you release. Whereas ticket taxes, it's a bit more complex to integrate that carbon content to it. And as Bill said, there are loads of actual legal ways of implementing kerosene taxation today. It's legal today to implement it domestically. So France or Germany and others can implement it on domestic flights. There are also ways to implement bilateral taxation. So having, you know, a group of states like the Nordics, the Benelux, deciding to impose a tax on the fuel that is sold to airlines having flights in between those countries. So there is, you know, legally ways of building up momentum to have kerosene taxation at the sort of national and bilateral level, in the hope of getting a European tax down the line. And I think something important to mention as well is that there was a big debate on digital tax. So taxing, you know, the big, the Google, the Amazons, etc. And we've seen a few tendencies from the European Commission right now to consider other ways of regulating taxation at the European level, and maybe finding ways of not always using unanimity as a rule, but maybe using a normal voting procedure. For the moment, it's more on the digital taxation angle, but I think that can have repercussions for the rest of the different, taxation files that will follow. And so just on a last point on taxes, I think, we talk a lot about the kerosene tax because of the carbon component, but we do think that ticket taxes are a good option to sort of replace the VAT that we don't have today on tickets. So it could be a replacement, but we still need both because, we still need a sufficient price signal to integrate the cost that flying actually has on the environment. So now moving on to flight limitations, I think the first one that I see, and it's been mentioned already, the first one that I see that actually could be, feasible, or that COVID has kind of brought back up to the surface is, banning airport expansion, because, COVID gives that the momentum to do that, because it has governments and the industry and investors have to reset their growth expectations. Why would you invest today in growing an airport when actually no one's flying, and we don't think that flying is going to kick back in a few years. So I think that's something, that's a hook and an opportunity to pursue when it comes to limiting airport expansion, because there would be a renewed momentum around that. When it comes to air traffic rights, banning, flight limitations, I think, it hasn't been studied yet. Well, at least Transport and Environment, we haven't studied that more in details. How do you allocate or limit the number of slots that you give airlines in an airport? Would it be legal to do it only on a national level? Would you need to do it at the European level? Because would it be just shifting traffic from one member state to another? And fundamentally, how do you ensure you keep long-haul emissions in the scope of your campaign? Because we know that domestic, some people have said it already, domestic flying should be cut when rail alternatives exist, but it's still, in terms of emissions, not as much as long-haul, that are basically the biggest amount of pollution and the biggest non-CO2 impact as well. So that's something to keep in mind. We can't forget the long-haul flights. And then fundamentally, something I wanted to mention is on behavior change in terms of passengers. And we focus a lot right now on how business travel was one of the biggest parts of passengers, of air passengers, before COVID. And now that we've seen how it is with Zoom, and we've seen how our meetings will maybe change, that's the part of the passenger sort of demographic that's going to likely change the most. Even though I do see a lot of business travel associations saying that we'll still need meetings, face-to-face, networking, and that there's a lot of discussion around, well, what do you look for in a big meeting when you're, I don't know, a banker, a trader, or a businessman? You look for the networking opportunities. The content of the actual conference is maybe 10% of the reason why they're going there. They want, the face-to-face, they want so maybe business travel will come back at one point. So we can't ignore that that's a possibility. Same for tourism. We see a lot of people now saying, well, we'll focus more on this summer going to, my village in France just next to Belgium. But I feel that there's also this whole debate about, well, we've been given a freedom as a young generation to fly. Why can't we use it again? And why can't we just go to, Thailand and Asia and other places on our holiday? So fundamentally, to conclude, I think, taxes, even though right now the COVID crisis has put a bit of a taxes like on a difficult situation, but that's because the industry is trying to, minimize the amount of obligations that they can pay, that they will pay in the future. But I think that there is a big big conversation to have around taxes not just making air travel a rich mode of transport, because air travel has always been a rich mode of transport, as you know, has been said before by Ali. You know, we see the numbers. We see that the half of population don't even take one flight in the year. You know, so we have to fight back against that narrative, which is, you know, taxes will only make flying more expensive, and the poor family of four will suffer the most. I think we have to fight back with that, with those figures. Anyway, I think that was what I kind of wanted to say, because I want to leave enough time for discussion, of course. But I think, yeah, the taxation issue and the COVID angle has to be managed properly, and we should use this as an opportunity to tell governments taxation and limitations are the way to manage the degrowth of aviation post-crisis.
All right, thanks a lot, Joe, for this, for commenting all those different possibilities for measures. And are there any questions of understanding to Joe? Okay, there has been this question of long-haul emissions compared to short and middle-haul emissions, but this has already been answered. No, I think, Bill, you answered this, and you just wrote your answer to me, so maybe you can send it again to the whole list. And Eric answered it for France. All right, so we now have still about 30 minutes for that discussion, and I invite all of you to share your opinions on what you've heard. And first of all, I would like to invite and ask Gabriela, do you have any comments on this? I would like to invite you to maybe say something, but you don't need to, just in case you want, and in case the internet connection is stable. I don't know how it's working.
In a minute?
Yes.
Can you wait 2-3 minutes?
Of course,
please?
of course, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. And I also want to ask Naomi from the Tax Justice Network, do you have a comment on what has been said?
Am I going after Gabriela or now?
No, you can go now, and we wait for Gabriela to
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for those presentations. They were really interesting, and the airline industry is in more catastrophic difficulty than I realised, which I guess is good news. I think, speaking personally, I would have liked to see airlines sink, quite honestly. I'm speaking personally, rather than be bailed out, or there be some kinds of calls for the public to have a stake in something that's so damaging, possibly then a stake in furthering something which is not in the public interest. You know, maybe there are arguments for that, but I can't see them personally. But I think what's really interesting is for us, one of the big concerns with the airline industry has also been about the sort of ideas about economic development, and the ideas and subsidies that were happening in terms of construction of new airports and expansion, all in the name of development, economic development, and the problems that that has caused with things like economic free zones, which the global anti-air metropolis movement tracks so well. Yeah, I'm kind of interested to see what people think about how this kind of catastrophic hit to airlines might affect, for example, the Brexit strategy for developing free ports, which, as we know, are sort of the same types of problems as we've seen with economic free zones, bad for labour laws, bad for tax, potential tax and money laundering, tax dodging and money laundering. Yeah, I was wondering if there are studies also on, in terms of, you know, if we were to transfer wealth through tax, or in terms of investment away from aviation and towards public transport and integrated rail systems, more night trains, and actually making transport either free or very low cost. You know, whether there are studies on how that new world could look for people as a result of taking action on the airlines. I mean, we've done similar things with tax justice calculations, and, you know, for example, the taxes that Google should have paid, you know, could have funded 50,000 nurses for the National Health Service, that type of thing. Yeah, it's been really interesting listening to what you've all been saying, and I'm happy to have heard about it. We have our own online conference on the 10th and 11th of December on financing the climate transition, and we'll be discussing fossil fuel subsidies among other things. But thanks.
Thank you. And what do you think about the pros and cons of like kerosene tax? Is it actually just? Is it a just measure? Would you say?
Yeah, you know, I think you have to have taxes and limits. You know, I'm not a tax expert, but I think it's a question of devising something that is fair. But also, I mean, I'm quite in favour of doing something like banning private jets, for example, as a good, strong first step. Like, hearing a lot of feedback, so I'm not sure how well you can hear me.
Okay, sorry. Yes, we heard you. Thank you. Gabriela, would you like to comment on this? I think you're still muted. We still need to unmute you. Okay. No, Gabriela, you're still unmuted.
Sorry, Gabriela, I unmuted you because of the feedback, but now it should work.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to. I thank each of the speakers for their knowledge of the issues, their efforts and desire for contribution in transmitting it to us. These exhibitions have led us important reflections from a vision of justice, although it will surely be necessary to continue working on these issues. However, I would like to emphasize the idea of increasing awarenesses in people. We are living through very difficult times of health, economic, social, and ecological crisis, but that could also be a good opportunity to more easily reach people's sensitives. Taxes and limits are important, but we need to do more to raise awarenesses of not flying. Thank you.
Gabriela, I now don't hear you anymore. Do the others hear Gabriela?
Yeah.
Okay, you're just gone, Gabriela.
Yeah, well, I just finished my comment. Did you hear me? Did you hear me?
The last thing we
Do you want me to repeat?
The last thing we heard, Gabriela, was
yes.
I think the connection is
yes, let me know.
The last thing we heard is that taxes and limits are important, but we need to do more to raise awareness to reduce flying. And after that, we didn't.
Yes, I finished my comment. I finished my comment with that phrase.
Okay, So I think others actually heard your whole comment. Maybe it was just me. So I'm sorry in case just I didn't understand it. Okay, thank you very much, Gabriela. So I would invite every one of you to also share your views on this question. Oh, Gabriela, I'm sorry, I can't hear you anymore. I think you're muted again. If you... Yes.
Yes, I am mute because I finished my comment.
Okay. Thank you. Then I think we all heard your comment. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I have Anna on my list.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
yeah, nice to see you. So I'm Anna Hughes. I'm from Flight Free UK, and we're a behaviour change group here in the UK. We ask people to take a year off flying, and the idea is to inform them of the climate impact of aviation and inspire them to travel by other means. It's been really interesting to hear everything. And of course, as you might imagine, we agree that there needs to be taxation and limitation. The measures we propose are frequent flyer levy, tax on aviation fuel, retention of APD, no airport expansion. Those are kind of the fundamentals. I think something that we need to make sure about is that we are using the right messaging. And what I mean by that is, in terms of justice, everybody would agree that justice is important. As Ali said, a frequent flyer levy is popular because people value fairness, which is correct, except for something that people also, one of the dangers of, or the difficulties rather, sorry, one of the difficulties of using phrases like frequent flyer is that no one thinks it's them. So we need to be very clear about what a frequent flyer is. And in terms of the frequent flyer levy, for example, to qualify as a frequent flyer, you need only take 3 return flights a year. That is most of my friends. I think we all know people who take 3 flights a year, and those people probably don't see themselves as frequent flyers. So this is where a wider acknowledgement of who we are targeting, who we're aiming at, and who we need to be addressing, especially, so we had the figures yesterday from Oxfam. The richest 1% in the world cause more than double the carbon emissions of the poorest 50%, which is an incredibly unequal situation. More to that though, the richest 10%, I don't know the exact figure in terms of carbon emissions, but to be in the richest 10% in the world, you need only earn 30 grand or more. I'm sure some of us sitting here earn 30 grand or more. So, but that isn't actually a lot. That's not really a lot for being part of a Western society. So we need to really communicate. That is what we are fighting against, the injustice of the global scenario, and communicate to those people in the West and in Europe, because that's where most of us are based, and that's who does the most flying, what that actually means. I think we can all agree that aviation coming in at a 0 VAT rate, whereas bicycles come in at 20% VAT, we can all agree that that's unfair. But when we talk about who takes most of the flights, people tend to think, oh, it's the businessman who's on a plane every other day. But actually, it's also us who take 3 flights a year, and that doesn't seem very many. So yeah, I think that's really, really important. And also, just one more thing, we have to, so already, I'm obviously speaking about the UK because that's where most of my knowledge comes from. Already in the UK, about half of people can't afford or don't get on a plane in any given year. Is that because they can't afford it? Do we want to allow flights to be accessible to the very poorest? In the UK, well, flights are already not accessible to the very poorest across the world. So why would we why would it be fairer to allow poor people in the UK to fly if poor people across the world who are suffering the effects of climate change now can't? I suppose what I'm trying to say is in conclusion, we just need to be really clear about what we mean by global justice and who we really are talking about in terms of the people who, the polluters, which is really all of us.
Okay, thanks, Anna. You got lots of agreement in the chat. And I have Manuel and then Tone on my list. And I ask you to keep your comments short so that we can still have 2 or 3 more.
Yeah. Yeah, mine goes in a similar direction. It's about messaging, and it was also mentioned a little bit like that. I think the cost that flying has on the environment was mentioned, and I would argue strongly for not presenting an argument like that, saying there is a certain cost, you can monetize it, you can measure it, really, that flying has on the economy, or that flying has socially, like maybe many of us know the social cost of carbon, this concept, because I think it's a fallacy, like speaking in the terms and in the rhetoric of actually people who are opposing everything we stand for, and who are opposing an ecological and just society with such an economist rhetoric. I would rather speak about, when it comes to taxes, finding the right price to steering, changing the economy or certain parts of it in the right way, finding the right price for that, but not arguing in a way that there is a certain right price for weighing out the damage that is being done to the environment and to people.
Okay, yes, thanks. Also some agreement on this. Okay, Tone just said she doesn't want to speak, so I now have Greta on my list.
Yes, hi everyone. Sorry, I don't have a video. My camera is really bad and you wouldn't see me anyway. I would like to comment on, I'm from Umverkehr, a small environmental NGO in Switzerland focused on transport policy. And I would also like to comment on the frequent flyer levy. As much as I like the idea of the justice point, I think it's also dangerous, because in my opinion, a frequent flyer levy where you say, okay, kind of the first flight is basically free or not taxed, it kind of gives people a sense that it's their right to fly, and it's their right to fly without a tax. And I think it's a bit of a first world problem to have such a frequent flyer levy, because as we just heard, we are all the rich people in the world, and we are all frequent flyers if we're still flying. So I think flying should just be much more expensive, and it should be so for everyone. I know that there will be social injustices, but as we also heard, it's already unjust. It's already the richest of the rich flying the most. So yeah, just wanted to comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so some similar comments to this direction, that taxes are not unjust and that the price should be higher. I just want to maybe point out that that right now here we are all of the Europeans who are here are, I think, white and probably don't have a migration background and are probably not part of the the people we were talking about, of the ones who maybe of working class, who haven't really afforded flights, or who just took their first flight last year or something. I know some of those people, and I do think that they would probably have a different opinion on that. Just to say that, even though I agree that it's unjust that aviation is not taxed the same as other transport modes, and even it should be taxed more than other transport modes. But just want to make clear that maybe it would be really good to also in our discussions include those other perspectives, and really invite also people with other backgrounds to join those discussions. Okay, I have Ali on my list.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that as well. I think it's probably also worth us thinking about like taxing aviation within the context of the wider transport system, and that obviously if we want to make flying less accessible, or we want people to still be able to travel them, that does need, you know, a functioning train network that people can afford. I mean, in the UK, it's literally cheaper for somebody to fly to Spain than to get a train to a different part of the UK. Like, that's clearly immensely unhelpful, and, you know, it's partly a relic of the very artificial tax structures that we have, but obviously it's something that needs to be fixed.
Yes, all right. Also some agreement. Vicky, did you also want to say something? Sorry if I missed your...
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm an environmental activist with Alethea and various other groups.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, maybe if I come closer to my microphone, is
yes, that works.
Fair? Yeah, I was saying I'm an environmental activist with Alethea and other groups, and I live in an area near a large airport in the Paris suburbs near Orly. And one of the major problems that we have in communicating the message to the public at large is the inevitable argument of job destruction. And I think if we want to, we need to get the unions somehow on our side, and we need to put forward the message that the workers in the aviation industry are also, maybe more than anybody else, the ones who are going to suffer. So what message? I would say we need a message oriented to those people. We really need to concentrate on reconversion, using their skills in other sectors of industry, green energy, tons of technicians, highly skilled people that need to get out of the airline industry before it crashes with them on board, if you see what I mean. So I would welcome any suggestions anybody has as to what kind of message to put out to this type of person category.
Thank you, Vicky. Yes, so that's basically the topic of the just transition, also the last webinar we had. Since we're almost approaching 6 p.m. Here, at least in Germany, it's 6 p.m. I would like to finish this webinar. I think we could still continue to talk for 2 hours. There's still lots of open questions, and I think we haven't really in-depth discussed the question of what makes sense right now. Like, in case we have in our organization only the possibility to make one campaign, one very targeted campaign, which one would it be? Would it be on a frequent flyer levy? Would it be on kerosene tax? Would it be on limits limits to airports and shifting short-haul flights to the railway? So we won't be able to discuss this in depth, but I just want to propose to make the same poll again, and you can the same poll we did in the beginning, and you can just answer like what if you were only able to make one campaign, which would you focus on limits or on taxes? So.
Can you see the poll? I have already shared it.
Yes, I think most people voted. No, some are still voting. We still wait some more moments. Okay. Yeah, let's end the polling. Okay, so we have 74% saying I would do taxes and 40% saying I would do limits. Okay, that's interesting. So actually the taxes went up a bit and the limits went down. Maybe also because we had more inputs on the tax side, but maybe also because it makes sense at this point. I'm sure we will continue discussions within the network. And I would like to invite you to fill out an even other poll, which would be for evaluating this webinar. I just posted it in the chat, so please click on this link before we end the call. And I want to thank you all for participating, and thank you speakers for your very interesting inputs. And yeah, you will read the summary on our website and be able to view the recording again. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye.